So this the lesson from Exodus. I actually had taped a message or meditation on this passage for the diocesan podcast. So you don't have to go there. You can come directly to St. Matthew's Online Abbey and get it straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So uh, this passage from Exodus, Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 12, is one of my favorite parts of the Old Testament. There's so much here, but I especially wanted to dwell today on seeing and hearing God and the seeing and hearing of God. So, in this passage, God reveals himself. He reveals himself to Moses. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and tell them I am sent you. That this is the quintessential this is the Magna Carta of biblical revelation, that God speaks to us. He gives Moses his word. The first way that God reveals himself to Moses is that God speaks, right? And then also Moses sees God in the burning bush, and so God reveals himself to human sight, and so that he reveals himself through mighty works, and ultimately is going to be the mighty work of delivering Israel from the land of Egypt. They will be able to see that. They will be able to see that God has acted in history, acted in the creation, has intervened. But before, in a sense, one of the things that we celebrate at Christmas is that before, and which is so beautifully illustrated by this passage, is that before we see and hear God, this passage makes clear that God has seen and heard us. So what is the revelation? How does God reveal himself to Moses? He says, it's like right out of the box, I have heard my people's cries. I have seen their sufferings. So God's own revelation to us, our hearing God and seeing God, is itself a revelation of God's prior seeing and hearing us. This is the economy of grace, right? We respond to what God has already done for us in his love. And even as we hear and see that love of God, it is that seeing and hearing is itself a response to a prior seeing and hearing by God of humanity, and a seeing and hearing of something in particular. That is, that God's ears and eyes are open to human suffering. It is precisely in our brokenness, precisely in injustice, precisely in human pain, and ultimately in human death, that God sees and hears us most clearly. This is when we enter into those times, ironically, paradoxically, when we often feel farthest away from God, that we are called to have the trust, to have the faith that actually God hears us even more clearly in those places where we feel farthest away. God's hearing and seeing is actually closer than we are to ourselves. That's the God and the relationship with God that this passage from Exodus reveals to us. That before we see and hear God, long before we see and hear God in our lives, we are called to know that God has seen and heard us and has already begun to act. Remember, God has already started the wheels of deliverance in motion, and the Israelites in Egypt, they don't even know it. They don't know what Moses has seen on Mount Horeb, but God is on his way. And so precisely in our darkest hour, in our greatest suffering, in our brokenness and our vulnerability, we are called to trust that God has seen and heard us, and that our deliverance is already in motion. Already God is acting. And we, in our seeing and our hearing of God, are simply catching up with what God has already done for us. A reading from the book of Exodus. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.